The gloves were pale, ivory perhaps, or cream. Edward Ashford, 8th Duke of Greymoor, had never been good with such distinctions, though his mother had tried to teach him once, long ago, holding fabric swatches up to the afternoon light in the conservatory at Greymoor House, speaking in a language of undertones and hues that seemed to him as foreign as Latin or Greek. He had been 12 then, restless and uninterested, shifting from foot to foot while she held silk and satin and damask against the window, murmuring words like écru and champagne and bone. He had not understood why it mattered. Pale was pale, white was white. What difference did the name make? Now, at 34, standing in the doorway of the drawing room on a grey October afternoon, he stared at a pair of gloves lying folded on the armchair by the west window, and he realized with a peculiar hollow ache that he still did not know what color they were, only that they were hers. The room was still. The fire had burned low in the grate, reduced to glowing coals that pulsed faintly, like the last heartbeat of something dying. The servants had not yet come to clear away the tea things. 2 cups still sat on the mahogany side table near the hearth, one half empty, the other untouched, a thin skin forming on the surface of the milk. The scent of bergamot lingered in the air, faint but unmistakable, mingling with the smell of rain that drifted through the open window. The curtains stirred, a soft, indifferent movement, as though the house itself were breathing. She was gone. Edward did not need to be told. He had known the moment he stepped through the front door, his hat still damp from the drizzle outside, his coat heavy and cold against his shoulders. There was a particular quality to silence when someone was no longer there, not absent, not away for the afternoon or upstairs resting or walking in the gardens. Gone. A void that was not empty, but somehow full, full of what had been, and now was not. He had felt it before, once. The day his father died, 14 years ago. He had come home from London to find Greymoor House exactly as it always was, the same furniture, the same portraits on the walls, the same servants moving quietly through the halls, and yet utterly transformed. His father's absence had been a presence, palpable and oppressive, filling every room like smoke. This was different. This absence was quiet, gentle almost, as though she had slipped away, without disturbing anything, careful even in her leaving not to cause trouble. Edward crossed the room slowly, his boots soundless on the Persian rug his grandmother had brought back from some diplomatic voyage decades before. He did not pick up the gloves. Not yet. He only stood there, his hands clasped behind his back in the military posture his father had drilled into him from childhood, shoulders straight, spine rigid, chin level, looking down at them as though they were a letter written in a language he had never learned to read. The fingers were pressed together, folded neatly at the center, as though she had only just slipped them off, as though she might return any moment and reach for them with that small, automatic gesture she had, tugging each finger loose one by one, never hurried, always deliberate, her head tilted slightly as though concentrating on some private thought. But she would not return. He had seen her this morning, or had it been yesterday? Time had become strange lately, slippery, the days blending together in a grey monotony that he had not noticed accumulating until now, when it suddenly mattered. She had been sitting in this very chair, her hands folded in her lap, her face turned toward the window. The weak autumn light had caught the side of her jaw, the curve of her throat, illuminating the fine bones beneath her skin. He had paused in the doorway, he remembered that now, intending to speak to her. To say what? He could not remember. Perhaps he had meant to ask if she needed anything, or to tell her he would be riding out to inspect the tenant farms and would not return until late. Perhaps he had simply meant to bid her good morning, but he had said nothing. His steward had been waiting in the hall with some urgent matter about drainage in the south fields, and Edward had turned away toward his study because there had been correspondence to attend to. Always correspondence. Letters from his man of business in London. Note from his solicitor regarding some tiresome legal complication with a property boundary. An invitation to a dinner party at Haverton Manor that he had no intention of attending. Had she said something to him as he passed? Had she called his name? He did not think so, but he was not certain, and now it was too late to ask. Edward sank into the chair opposite hers, his chair, the one with the worn leather armrests and the slight sag in the cushion where he sat every evening after dinner, reading the newspaper or the agricultural reports, or simply staring into the fire while she embroidered or played the piano or sat in that profound stillness she possessed, that quietness he had mistaken, God help him, for contentment. He stared at the gloves. They were small, delicate. The leather was soft, buttery, clearly expensive though not ostentatious. There was a tiny row of pearl buttons at each wrist, fastened carefully. The stitching along the seams was so fine he could barely see. Each thread laid with precision. She had worn them the day they met. That was 8 months ago, late April, spring. The world green and bright and full of that particular hopefulness that comes with warming weather and longer days. A garden party at Haverton Manor, one of those interminable social gatherings his mother insisted he attend despite his protests, despite his repeated assertions that he had no interest in parading himself before the daughters of the gentry like a prize bull at market. "You are a duke, Edward," she had said. Her voice clipped with the impatience of a woman who had spent 3 decades trying to teach a stone to speak. "You have a position, a responsibility. You cannot hide away at Greymore forever, pretending the world does not exist." "I am not pretending anything, I am simply managing my estates." "You are avoiding life." He had not replied. There was no point. She would not understand, or perhaps she understood too well, and that was the problem. So, he had gone. He had stood on the terrace at Haverton with a glass of champagne he did not drink, nodding politely at acquaintances whose names he forgot immediately, enduring the parade of young women and their mothers who approached him with smiles sharp as knives, their conversation a calculated dance of flattery and insinuation. And then he had seen her. She had been standing beneath a chestnut tree at the far edge of the garden, alone, watching the others with a peculiar stillness. She was not beautiful in the way that commanded attention. Her features were fine but unremarkable. A straight nose, a small mouth, clear grey eyes beneath dark brows. Her dress was pale green, simple, well made but not extravagant. No lace, no embroidery, no jewels beyond a single strand of pearls at her throat. What struck him was not her appearance, but the way she stood, utterly still, rooted, as though she were part of the landscape, as though she had grown there among the roots of the chestnut tree, and would remain there long after everyone else had gone. She did not look at him the way others did. There was no flutter of eyelashes, no practiced tilt of the head, no coy glance over a fan. When their eyes met, accidentally, he thought later, though perhaps it had not been an accident at all, her expression was calm, faintly curious, and entirely without expectation. No hunger, no calculation, just observation. He had crossed the lawn toward her without deciding to do so. Later, he would not remember making the choice, would not recall the moment when his feet began to move, only that he had been standing on the terrace with his untouched champagne, and then he had been standing in front of her, beneath the dappled shade of the chestnut tree, and she had been looking at him with those steady grey eyes that seemed to see something he had not known was visible. "You are the Duke of Greymore," she had said. Not a question, a statement of fact, delivered without inflection, as one might remark on the weather or the color of the sky. "I am. And you are here because your mother insists you attend these things." He had smiled despite himself. It was such a direct observation, so plainly spoken without any of the usual social padding, that it disarmed him entirely. "You are perceptive, Miss Whitmore, Clara Whitmore." She had extended her hand. The glove had been soft, impossibly soft, and warm from the sun. He had taken it, held it perhaps a moment longer than propriety strictly allowed, and she had not pulled away. She had simply waited, patient, until he released her. "Are you here because your mother insists?" he had asked, trying to recover his equilibrium. "No, I came because I wanted to see the gardens. Lady Haverton's roses are supposed to be remarkable this time of year. You prefer gardens to people. I prefer honest things." He had not known what to say to that. So he had said nothing. They had stood there in the dappled shade while the noise of the party, laughter, conversation, the clink of glasses, drifted over them, distant and unimportant, and he had felt something shift inside his chest. A loosening, a relief he had not known he was seeking. He had thought then that he had found something rare, something true. Now, sitting alone in the darkening drawing room, Edward reached out with hands that felt clumsy and strange and picked up the gloves. They were lighter than he expected, insubstantial. He turned them over, slowly, studying the delicate stitching along the seams, the tiny pearl buttons, the faint creases in the leather where her fingers had bent them. She had left them behind. Why? Had she forgotten them? No, Clara forgot nothing. She was meticulous, careful, deliberate in all things. If she had left them, it was intentional. A message. But what message? What was she trying to say? Edward stood abruptly, the gloves clutched in his hand, and crossed to the window. The rain had stopped. The gardens, stretched out below, grey-green and glistening, the gravel paths dark with moisture. The rose beds his grandmother had planted were fading now, the blooms brown and drooping. The hedge maze beyond looked skeletal, bare branches reaching toward the low clouds. She used to walk there. Every afternoon, unless the weather was truly foul, he would watch her sometimes from his study window on the floor above, a small figure in pale dresses, moving slowly along the paths, stopping to examine a flower or a leaf, her head bent in concentration, entirely absorbed in something he could not name. He had never joined her. She had never asked him to. Had she wanted him to? Had she been waiting for him to offer? He pressed his forehead against the cool glass. His breath fogged the pane, obscuring his reflection. Had he loved her? The question rose unbidden, unwelcome, and hung in the air like smoke. He thought he had. He had believed he had. But had he? Or had he simply been relieved by her? Relieved that she did not demand, did not cling, did not weep or sulk or require constant attention and reassurance the way he had seen other wives do, the way his mother had, silently, invisibly, craved from his father for 30 years. Clara had been easy, unobtrusive. She had fit into his life without disrupting it, like a piece of furniture chosen for its practicality rather than its beauty, and he had thought that was enough. The realization settled over him slowly, cold and heavy as snow. He had thought she was content. He had thought silence meant peace. God forgive him. Do you see it yet? The way we convince ourselves that someone's quietness is satisfaction? That their lack of complaint means happiness? Or are you still certain you would have known better? Edward had not wanted to marry, not because he disliked women or feared intimacy in any abstract philosophical sense, but because he understood with cold, crystalline clarity what marriage was in his world. A contract, a transaction, a merger of estates and bloodlines and social position, undertaken with the same practical consideration one might bring to the purchase of property or the breeding of horses. Love, if it existed at all in such arrangements, was incidental, optional, often, in fact, inconvenient. His parents' marriage had been the model, the template. The 7th Duke of Greymoor and his Duchess, united in holy matrimony in the chapel at Greymoor House in 1795, had been by all accounts a suitable match. He had been 32, already established in his position, financially secure, in possession of one of the finest estates in the county. She had been 19, the daughter of an earl, beautiful, accomplished, trained from birth in the art of managing a great household. The wedding had been, by all reports, magnificent. The marriage had been something else entirely. Edward's earliest memories were of silence, not the comfortable silence of companionship, but the oppressive silence of two people occupying the same space without truly inhabiting it together. His father had been a man of impeccable reputation and absolutely no warmth. He had performed his duties as a husband with the same detached efficiency he brought to managing his tenant farms and overseeing his investments. He had provided for his wife. He had been faithful as far as Edward knew, no mistresses, no illegitimate children, no scandals. He had treated her with unfailing politeness, addressing her always as my dear or madam, never by her given name. And he had destroyed her, not through cruelty, not through violence or infidelity or any of the dramatic sins that made for gossip and scandal, but through absence, through the slow, relentless withholding of anything resembling affection or genuine interest, through 40 years of perfectly civil indifference. Edward's mother had been a beautiful woman once, He had seen the portraits painted in the early years of her marriage. The young Duchess with bright eyes and a hopeful smile, her head tilted just so, her hand resting lightly on the back of a chair, everything about her posture suggesting anticipation, as though she were waiting for something wonderful to begin. By the time Edward was old enough to notice such things, to understand what he was seeing, that brightness had long since faded. His mother moved through Greymore House like a ghost, perfectly dressed, perfectly mannered, performing her role with flawless precision, overseeing the household, managing the servants, hosting dinner parties and charity events, but somehow absent even when present. Her face had taken on a peculiar quality, a smoothness that was not youthful, but rather the result of holding the same neutral expression for so long that it had become permanent, like water wearing a waystone. She never complained. She never wept, at least not where anyone could see her. She never raised her voice or slammed doors, or did any of the things Edward imagined other unhappy wives might do. She simply diminished, year by year, season by season, until she became a woman who existed only in public, who came alive only when performing the role of Duchess, gracious, elegant, appropriate, and who ceased to exist entirely when alone. Edward had been 18 when his father died, a heart seizure, sudden and undramatic, in his study after dinner on a Tuesday evening in March. The Duke had been reviewing estate accounts when it happened. The butler found him slumped over his desk, his hand still holding his pen, a half-finished sentence trailing off into nothing. The funeral had been attended by everyone of consequence in the county and quite a few dignitaries from London. His mother had stood beside the grave in her black mourning dress, straight-backed and dry-eyed, her face composed in that same smooth, impenetrable expression she always wore. Afterward, she had returned to Greymore House, retired to her rooms, and emerged the following morning to resume her routines, as though nothing whatsoever had changed. Perhaps for her nothing had. Edward had inherited the title, the estates, the investments, the responsibilities, the weight of generations of Ashfords who had held these lands and borne this name. And he had inherited something else too, though he had not recognized it at the time. The example. His father's ghost had taken up residence in his study, in the set of his shoulders, in the way he signed his name, with that same cramped, precise handwriting, in the way he approached every task with methodical efficiency and no joy whatsoever. He had sworn, silently, standing in that study surrounded by ledgers and legal documents and letters of condolence, that he would not become that man. He would not marry out of duty and social obligation, only to proceed to ignore his wife for 30 years. He would not trap some hopeful young woman in a cage of propriety and indifference. He would not be the instrument of anyone's slow erasure. So he had not married. He had managed the estates, he had improved the drainage systems, modernized the farming methods, repaired tenant cottages, increased crop yields. He had fulfilled his social obligations, attended Parliament when necessary, served as magistrate, contributed to local charities. He had been, by all accounts, a responsible and respectable duke, and he had been entirely alone. It had not troubled him, or so he told himself. Solitude was preferable to the slow murder of a loveless marriage. He had his work, his books, his horses, the satisfaction of seeing Greymore prosper, of knowing his tenants were cared for, of maintaining the legacy his family had built over centuries. It was enough. It had to be enough until Clara. He had not expected her, had not been looking for her, had in fact been quite firmly convinced that he would never marry, that he would allow the title to pass to some distant cousin upon his death and be done with it. But there she had been, standing beneath that chestnut tree at the Haverton garden party, and something in him had recognized something in her. What? He still was not entirely sure. A shared understanding, perhaps. A similar temperament. The quality of someone who had also learned to be alone and had made peace with it. They had spoken for over an hour that first day, about nothing consequential. The gardens, a book she had been reading, some novel he had never heard of. The ridiculous spectacle of London society, which they both agreed was exhausting. She had a quiet wit, subtle and dry, that surfaced unexpectedly. When he said something she disagreed with, she told him so plainly, without apology or coquettishness. "I think you're wrong about that," she had said when he made some observation about the natural order of social hierarchy. "Am I?" "Yes. You're confusing custom with inevitability. Just because something has always been done a certain way doesn't mean it's natural or necessary." He had been delighted. No one spoke to him like that. No one challenged him without ulterior motive. "You're remarkably direct, Miss Whitmore. I find indirectness exhausting. Life is too short to spend it guessing what people really mean." Over the following weeks he had called on her. She lived with her aunt, a widow, in a modest but well-appointed house near Guildford. Her parents were dead, he learned, killed in a carriage accident when Clara was 19. She had no siblings, no fortune to speak of, just a small inheritance that provided her with independence but not luxury. No suitors, or at least none she mentioned. She seemed entirely self-sufficient, content in her small routines, her quiet life. When he arrived, she greeted him warmly but without the breathless excitement he had seen in other young women. When he left, she did not pout or cling. She simply smiled and said she hoped to see him again. And she always did see him again, because he kept returning. Why had he kept returning? Because he had told himself at the time she was intelligent, pleasant, undemanding. Because conversation with her was easy, effortless, free of the usual social posturing. Because she seemed to expect nothing from him beyond the courtesy he would show any acquaintance. Because she did not need him. That was what he had thought, what he had believed, that her self-sufficiency was a virtue, that her lack of demands was a blessing. Now he wondered if what he had really meant was because she would not trouble him, because she would not require anything of him beyond what he was already prepared to give. He had proposed after 3 months of regular visits. It had not been romantic. He had not planned some grand gesture. They had been walking through the gardens at Greymoor. He had invited her to visit the estate, ostensibly to see the famous rose collection his grandmother had planted decades before, but really because he wanted her to see the place, to understand what she would be taking on if she agreed to marry him. They had been standing beside the fountain in the south garden, the water splashing softly behind them, the afternoon sun warm on their shoulders. She had been examining the roses, touching the petals gently, and he had turned to her and said quite simply, "Miss Whitmore, Clara, I wonder if you would consider becoming my wife." She had gone very still. For a long moment, she did not look at him. She kept her eyes on the roses, her hand hovering near a pale pink bloom. Then she had turned, and her expression had been unreadable, calm, almost neutral. "May I ask why you wish to marry me?" The question had surprised him. Most women would have said yes immediately, or at least pretended to need time to consider for propriety's sake. But Clara had asked why, as though it were a business proposition that required clear terms. He had answered honestly. That was something he prided himself on, his honesty. "Because I believe we would suit each other well. We share similar temperaments, similar interests. I do not expect passion or grand romantic gestures. I expect companionship, mutual respect, a partnership based on regard and compatibility, not love. I think love, as it is commonly described in novels and poetry, is a dangerous fiction, a temporary madness that leads people to make foolish decisions. I offer you something more reliable than that. Stability, security, kindness, respect. And you believe I offer you the same." "I do. I see." She had been silent then, turning back to the roses. He had watched her profile, the slight furrow between her brows, the way her lips pressed together as she considered. He had waited. He was good at waiting. Patient. That was one of his virtues. Finally, she had spoken. "I accept your proposal, Your Grace, on one condition." "Which is?" She had looked at him then, directly, and her grey eyes had been very clear, very serious. "That you do not lie to me, ever. If you find our marriage unsatisfactory, if you grow tired of me, if you wish to pursue other arrangements, as men of your position often do, I ask only that you tell me. I will not reproach you. I will not make difficulties, but I will not be made a fool. I will not live in ignorance while everyone around me knows the truth. Promise me that, and I will marry you." It had been such a strange condition, so plainly spoken, so devoid of sentiment or romance. But he had agreed. "I promise. I will never lie to you, Clara." And he had kept that promise. He had never lied to her, but he had come to understand too late that there were many ways to betray someone without ever speaking a single falsehood. They had married 6 weeks later in September, in the small chapel at Greymoor. No grand London wedding, no 300 guests, no spectacle. Just family and a handful of close friends. Clara had worn a simple gown of ivory silk. He had worn his father's ring. His mother had attended, stiff and formal in her usual way. She had kissed Clara's cheek afterward and said, "I hope you will be very happy, my dear." But her eyes had been empty, and Edward had seen Clara notice that emptiness, had seen something flicker across her face. Doubt, perhaps, or recognition. The wedding night had been awkward, not unpleasant, but mechanical. Clara had been calm, almost clinical in her approach. She had fulfilled her wifely duty with quiet composure, without complaint or enthusiasm. Afterward, she had lain beside him in the dark of his my bedroom and said softly, "Thank you for being gentle." He had not known what to say, so he had said nothing. In the weeks and months that followed, they had settled into routines, patterns, the rhythms of married life. Breakfast together in the morning room. Then he would go to his study to attend to correspondence and estate business. She would occupy herself with the household, the gardens, her needlework, her books. They would meet again for dinner. Afterward, they would sit together in the drawing room. Sometimes they spoke about the estate, about local news, about books they were reading. Often they did not speak at all. She would embroider or read. He would review reports or simply stare into the fire. It had been comfortable, hadn't it? He had thought so. He had believed they had achieved exactly what they had agreed upon, a partnership based on compatibility and mutual respect. No drama, no demands, no emotional turbulence, a rational marriage, a civilized marriage, a marriage like his parents. The realization came to him now like a physical blow, sitting in his study with her gloves still in his hand. He had become his father after all. Not in the details. He had been faithful, attentive in practical matters, never dismissive or cold in the way his father had been. But in the essential way, the way that mattered, he had taken a woman's quiet presence for granted. He had mistaken her lack of complaint for satisfaction. He had believed that because she did not weep or rage or demand his attention, she must be content. He had been so careful not to trap her in misery that he had never stopped to ask if she was actually happy. And now she was gone. Edward stood and crossed to the window. Evening was falling. The sky was the color of slate. In the gardens below, a lone figure moved along the gravel path. One of the gardeners, probably, making a final round. Before dark, he wondered where Clara was now. What she was doing, if she was warm, if she was safe, if she was relieved to be away from him. The thought was unbearable. But it might also be true. This story is a work of fiction, created for emotional reflection and storytelling. Any resemblance to real persons or events is purely coincidental. Tell me, can you live beside someone every day and still know nothing about what they feel? Edward thought he knew. He was wrong. How many of us make the same mistake? There was a dinner 3 weeks ago that Edward kept returning to. The memory surfaced now, unbidden, as he sat alone in the study late into the night, Clara's gloves on the desk before him like evidence of a crime he had not known he was committing. It rose out of the general blur of recent weeks, weeks that had, he now realized, been marked by a growing distance he had not noticed at the time, or had noticed and dismissed as temporary, or had perhaps willfully ignored because acknowledging it would have required him to do something, and he had not known what. They had hosted a dinner party, not a large one, 10 guests, 12, including themselves, mostly neighbouring gentry, the Havisham family from Blackwood Park, Colonel and Mrs. Pemberton, the vicar and his unmarried sister, young Mr. Crowley, who had just inherited his father's estate and was making the rounds of introductions, and Edward's cousin James, who had been passing through the county on his way to London and had stopped at Greymoor for a few days. His mother had arranged it. She still involved herself in the social calendar at Greymoor, though she spent most of her time at the Dower House now. She had sent a note insisting it was necessary to maintain proper connections with the neighbours, particularly the Havishams, who were people of consequence and whose good opinion mattered. Clara had not objected when Edward mentioned it. She never objected to anything. "A dinner party on Friday," he had said at breakfast one morning. "My mother has arranged it. The Havishams, the Pembertons, a few others, nothing too elaborate." "Of course," Clara had said. She had been buttering toast, her movements precise and unhurried. "Shall I coordinate with Mrs. Henderson about the menu?" "If you would." "How many guests?" 10, 12 with us. I'll speak to her this afternoon." And that had been the extent of the conversation. Simple, practical, exactly the sort of easy, undemanding exchange that had characterized their entire marriage. He should have noticed something then, should have heard what was absent from her response. No questions about who was coming, no excitement or anxiety about hosting, no opinions about the guest list or the menu, just quiet acceptance. But he had noticed nothing. He had finished his breakfast, thanked her, and gone to his study. The evening of the dinner, Clara had descended the stairs at precisely 7 o'clock. Edward had been in the entrance hall, adjusting his cufflinks when he looked up and saw her. She had been wearing a gown of deep blue silk, not new. He thought he had seen it before, though he could not remember when, but it suited her. The color brought something out in her eyes, a depth he had not noticed in some time, or perhaps had seen and failed to really look at. Her hair was arranged simply, pinned up with what he thought might be a silver comb. She wore no jewelry except her wedding ring and the strand of pearls at her throat that had belonged to her mother. She had looked lovely. He had opened his mouth to say so. The compliment had been right there, ready. "You look lovely, Clara." But at that moment, the door had opened, and James had come bounding in from outside, rain-spotted and cheerful, full of apologies for being late and stories about the appalling state of the roads. Edward had turned to greet him, and the moment had passed. Later, he would return to that moment obsessively, would replay it in his mind, wondering, if he had spoken then, if he had simply said, "You look lovely," would it have made a difference? Would it have been enough? Probably not. One compliment could not repair months, years perhaps, of accumulated small absences. But it might have been something, a small light in the darkness, a sign that he still saw her. But he had not spoken. He had greeted James, and then the other guests had begun to arrive, and Clara had slipped into her role as hostess with her usual quiet competence. The dinner itself had been tedious. Edward remembered very little of it now, though he must have participated in the conversation. The usual topics, the state of the roads, the weather, the harvest, local gossip. Mrs. Havisham had held forth at length about her daughter's upcoming wedding. Colonel Pemberton had bored everyone with stories from his military service. The vicar's sister had asked after Clara's needlework projects, with the particular intensity of someone who had no occupation or interests of her own. Clara had sat at the opposite end of the table, as was proper for a duchess. She had smiled when spoken to. She had nodded politely at the appropriate moments. She had made small comments here and there, gracious, appropriate, forgettable. She had eaten almost nothing. Edward had noticed that vaguely, but had thought little of it. Clara ate sparingly anyway. She always had. She was not one of those women who complained of her appetite or made a show of picking at her food. She simply ate small portions and left the rest. But looking back now, he realized she had not eaten at all. She had moved food around her plate with her fork, creating the illusion of eating, but he could not recall seeing her actually bring anything to her mouth. No one else had seemed to notice, or if they had not commented. After dinner, when the ladies withdrew and the men remained for port and cigars, James had leaned close to Edward and said, in a voice pitched low beneath the general conversation, "Your Duchess is a handsome woman, Edward. Quite striking, actually, though she doesn't make much of herself." "Thank you," Edward had said, though the compliment felt strangely hollow. "She's very quiet, though, isn't she? I confess I can barely get 2 words out of her. Is she shy? Or simply unwell?" "Neither. She is simply reserved by nature." "Reserved?" James had chuckled, swirling his port. "Is that what we're calling it? She seems rather remote, if you don't mind my saying so. Distant, as though she's not entirely present." "She is perfectly well," Edward had said, more sharply than he had intended. "She simply does not feel the need to dominate every conversation, unlike some people." James had raised his hands in mock surrender. "Peace, cousin. I meant no offense. I only wondered if perhaps marriage to you was not quite what she had expected. And what do you imagine she expected? I don't know. More, perhaps? Edward had not responded to that. He had poured himself another glass of port and steered the conversation forcibly toward politics. But the comment had lodged itself somewhere in his mind. More, perhaps. What was more? What could James possibly mean? Edward provided for Clara, protected her, treated her with respect, never raised his voice, never imposed on her, never made unreasonable demands. What more could reasonably be expected? Later, much later, when the guests had finally gone home and the house had settled into silence, Edward had found Clara in the drawing room. She had still been wearing the blue gown, though she had removed her pearls. She had been standing by the window, looking out at the dark gardens, her arms wrapped around herself as though cold, though the fire was still burning in the grate. "That went well, I think," Edward had said, coming to stand a few feet behind her. She had not turned. "Did it?" "I believe so." The Havishams seemed pleased, and James was in good form, as usual. "Yes." "Are you tired?" "You should rest." "Yes, I should." But she had not moved. She had stood there, her reflection faint in the glass, her face unreadable. Edward had felt briefly that he should stay, that there was something she wanted to say, or something he should say, though he could not imagine what. The feeling had been vague, formless, like trying to grasp smoke. But he had been tired himself, and there was correspondence he still needed to review before morning, and the moment had not seemed urgent. It had seemed like all the other moments, quiet, unremarkable, part of the general texture of their days. So he had said good night and left her there, standing alone by the window. It was only now, weeks later, that he realized. She had been waiting for him to ask, "Are you all right?" 3 words. So simple, so obvious, but he had not said them, and she had not volunteered the answer. The following morning, Clara had already eaten breakfast by the time Edward came. Down, the housekeeper mentioned that Mrs. Ashford— Edward still flinched inwardly at hearing Clara called that, as though the title belonged to someone else— had gone for a walk shortly after dawn. "In this weather," Edward had said, glancing out the window at the persistent drizzle. "Yes, Your Grace, she took her cloak and umbrella." "When did she return?" "Not yet, Your Grace." That was nearly 3 hours ago. Edward had felt a flicker of concern then. 3 hours was a long walk, especially in the rain. But he had said nothing. Clara was a grown woman. She could walk as long as she liked. He had gone to his study and immersed himself in work, tenant agreements that needed reviewing, letters about drainage improvements, a dispute between 2 farmers over a boundary line that required his mediation. He had not heard Clara return. He had not seen her for the rest of that day. Now, sitting in the dark study with the rain starting again outside, Edward pulled open one of the desk drawers and found what he was looking for: the household log where he sometimes made notes about estate matters, social engagements, reminders to himself. He paged back through the weeks. There, in his own handwriting, Sept 15, dinner party, Havishams, Pembertons, etc. And beneath it, added later in a different ink, as though the thought had come to him afterward, C seemed very quiet. Must remember to ask if unwell. He stared at those words. Must remember to ask. He had written that, had recognized that something was wrong, and then had forgotten, or had not forgotten exactly, but had never followed through. The reminder had remained in the log, unacted upon, while the days passed and Clara grew quieter and quieter, until finally she was silent altogether, and then she was gone. Edward closed the log and pushed it away from him. His hands were shaking slightly. He pressed them flat against the desk to still them. There was a knock at the door. Edward looked up, hope flaring absurdly in his chest. But of course it was not Clara. It was Peterson, the butler. "Your Grace, forgive the intrusion. I thought you should know that Mrs. Henderson has been asking about Her Grace's plans. The staff are uncertain about how to proceed with certain household matters." Edward stared at him. "Her Grace has left, Peterson." "Yes, Your Grace. We had surmised as much. Will she be returning?" "No." Peterson's face remained perfectly neutral, but Edward saw something flicker in his eyes, Sympathy, perhaps, or pity. "I see. Shall I inform the staff?" "Yes, thank you, Peterson." The butler bowed and withdrew, closing the door softly behind him. Edward was alone again. He thought of the dinner party, of Clara in her blue gown, standing by the window, waiting for him to see her, really see her. He thought of all the dinners before that, all the breakfasts, all the evenings in the drawing room, hundreds of hours spent in the same space, performing the rituals of marriage. And he had never once asked her what she was thinking, what she wanted, if she was happy. He had assumed. He had taken her silence for assent, her composure for contentment. What did your silence mean, Clara? He would never know now. The question would remain forever unanswered. Have you ever been in a room full of people and felt utterly alone? Have you ever stood beside someone you love and felt the unbridgeable distance between you? Clara knew that feeling. She lived it every day. And Edward never noticed. Edward did not sleep that night. He remained in the study until the fire burned to ash and the room grew cold, and the first grey light of dawn began to seep through the windows. The gloves sat on his desk where he had placed them hours before, pale and accusatory. At some point near morning he rose stiffly from his chair, his back aching, his eyes burning, and went upstairs. He had not entered Clara's room since she had left. He realized that now. He had avoided it, unconsciously perhaps, as though entering would make her absence more real, more permanent. But there were things that needed to be done. Her belongings would have to be sorted. Decisions would have to be made about what to keep, what to send to her wherever she had gone, what to dispose of, though the thought of disposing of anything that had belonged to her made him feel slightly ill. He stood outside her door for a long moment, his hand on the handle, gathering himself. Then he opened it and stepped inside. The room was exactly as she had left it. The bed was made, the coverlet smooth and unwrinkled. The wardrobe doors were closed. The curtains were drawn back, allowing weak morning light to illuminate the space. Everything was neat, orderly, impersonal almost, as though she had already been erasing herself before she left. Had she stayed here the last night, or had she already been gone by then? Edward realized he did not know. He had not seen her that evening. He had assumed she had retired early, as she sometimes did. He had been in his study, working late on some matter he could no longer remember. He had not thought to check on her. Why would he? She was a grown woman. She did not need to be checked on like a child. Except perhaps she had. Perhaps she had needed someone to notice, to care. He crossed to the wardrobe and opened it. Her dresses hung there, neat and evenly spaced. Not many. Clara had never been particularly interested in fashion or accumulating possessions. Perhaps a dozen gowns in muted colors, grey, dark green, pale lavender, the blue silk she had worn to the dinner party, several day dresses, a riding habit that, as far as he knew, she had never worn. He touched one of the sleeves. The fabric was soft, cool. It smelled faintly of lavender sachets. Which dresses had she taken with her? He tried to remember what she usually wore, tried to identify what might be missing, but realized with a sinking feeling that he could not. He had seen her every day for 8 months and could not recall specifically what she wore. Had he ever really looked at her? Or had he only ever seen the position she occupied? The Duchess, the wife, the woman who managed his household and sat across from him at meals and existed in the peripheral vision of his life. Edward closed the wardrobe and moved to the small writing desk that sat by the window. It was a delicate piece, mahogany with brass fittings, that Clara had brought with her from her aunt's house when she married, one of the few personal items she had insisted on keeping. The surface was bare except for an inkwell and a small stack of writing paper. He opened the single drawer. Inside were a few letters, correspondence with her aunt, mostly, about mundane matters. A list in Clara's neat handwriting of household tasks. Speak to Mrs. Henderson about the linen closet. Order more candles. Ask about the leak in the east wing. Practical, organized, exactly what one would expect from a competent wife managing a large household. And beneath that, a single piece of paper, folded once. His name was written on the outside in her careful script. Edward. His heart began to beat faster. His hands, when he reached for the paper, were not entirely steady. He sat down in her chair, the same chair where she must have sat to write this, and unfolded the letter. Edward, I am writing this because I cannot say it to your face, not because I fear your reaction. You are not a man who reacts strongly to anything, but because I fear my own resolve will fail if I see you. I have never been good at maintaining my position when challenged, and your presence, however quiet, is a form of challenge to what I must do. I am leaving. I know this will cause you inconvenience and perhaps some degree of social embarrassment. For that, I am sorry. I do not wish to make difficulties for you. You have always prided yourself on avoiding difficulties, and I have tried my best to honor that preference. But I cannot continue as I have been. Let me be clear. You have not been cruel. You have not betrayed me in any conventional sense. You have not taken a mistress or gambled away our fortunes or raised your voice to me or struck me or any of the dramatic transgressions that novels are full of. By the standards of many marriages, ours would be considered quite successful. You have been exactly what you promised to be: stable, secure, kind in your way, respectful, and I have been miserable. Not every day, not at first. At first I was relieved, grateful even. You offered me safety and position at a time when I had neither. You asked nothing of me that seemed unreasonable. You did not expect me to be something I was not. You seemed content with exactly what I could offer, which was very little. I thought that would be enough for me. I was wrong. You asked me once what I wanted from marriage. I said companionship. I believed that then. I believed I wanted nothing more than to exist beside someone, to share a household and a life in the quiet, practical way that seemed sustainable and safe. But I have learned, too late perhaps, that I want more than to exist beside someone. I want to exist with them. I want to be known, to be seen, not as a duchess or a wife or a woman who performs certain functions, but as myself, whatever that means, whoever that is. I do not think you see me, Edward. I think you see the role I occupy, the position I fill, the woman who does not make demands or cause trouble or require your attention beyond the minimum necessary. And I have allowed this. I have made myself small and quiet and unobtrusive because I thought that was what you wanted, what you needed. Because you seemed so determined to avoid anything resembling emotional entanglement that I convinced myself wanting such things was unreasonable, excessive. But I am tired. I am so very unspeakably tired. I am tired of sitting in rooms with you and feeling alone. I am tired of speaking words that disappear into silence. I am tired of watching you look through me as though I were made of glass. I am tired of measuring every impulse, every desire, every small hope against the fear that expressing it would somehow be a burden to you. I am tired of being invisible. Do you know that I tried, Edward? Do you know that I reached for you in my small ways? I asked you to walk with me in the gardens. You said you were too busy. I asked your opinion on books I was reading. You gave polite but perfunctory answers. I tried to learn about your work, your interests, the things that occupied your mind. You explained them to me as one might explain them to a child or a stranger. Informative but distant, never inviting me in. I told you once about the fox I saw near the North Woods. I was so delighted by it, by the way it had stood there in the early morning mist, watching me with those bright eyes. I thought you would be interested. You nodded and said, "How?" Pleasant, and returned to your newspaper. It was such a small thing, I know that, but it was one of 1,000 small things, and eventually they accumulated into something I can no longer carry. I am not blaming you entirely. Perhaps I should have been more direct. Perhaps I should have demanded your attention instead of hoping you would offer it. Perhaps I should have been less compliant, less willing to settle for the bare minimum of your regard. But I was afraid. I was afraid that if I asked for more, you would find me burdensome, excessive, one of those demanding wives that you clearly despise, the kind your father despised. So I made myself smaller and smaller, hoping that being undemanding would somehow make you want to turn toward me. It did not. You were relieved, I think, that I required so little. You could continue your life exactly as it had been before our marriage, with only minor adjustments. I fit neatly into the routines you had established. I did not disrupt. I did not require. I did not exist loudly enough to demand your notice, and so you did not notice me. I wonder sometimes if you would notice if I simply stopped, if I remained in the house but ceased speaking entirely. How long would it take before you realized? Days, weeks, Or would you simply accept my silence the way you have accepted everything else about me? As a pleasant convenience, a sign that our arrangement is working exactly as intended. I leave behind my gloves. You will find them in the drawing room. I wore them the day we met beneath that chestnut tree at Haverton. Do you remember that day? I do. I remember everything about it. The way the sunlight fell through the leaves, the sound of the water from the fountain behind us, the exact words you spoke when you asked me to marry you. I wonder if you remember any of it, or if it is all blurred together into the general mass of obligations fulfilled and duties discharged. I thought you might keep the gloves. A reminder, perhaps, of what you had, of what you lost. Though I suspect you will not think of it as a loss, you will be inconvenienced, certainly. There will be social awkwardness to navigate, but you will adapt. You always do. You will return to your studies and your accounts and your perfectly ordered life, and I will become a footnote. The Duchess who left. An unfortunate chapter now closed. I wish you well, Edward. I mean that sincerely. You are a good man in many ways. You are honorable and responsible and committed to your duties. You will be a good duke. You would have been a good father, I think, if we had been blessed with children. But you are not capable of being the husband I need. Not because you lack the capacity entirely, but because you cannot see the need. You have lived so long in your carefully constructed world of propriety and emotional distance that you have forgotten, or perhaps never learned, how to reach across that distance toward another person. And I cannot teach you. God knows I tried. Please do not come looking for me. I have made arrangements. I have somewhere to go, people who will care for me. I will be safe, and I will be, for the first time in a very long while, myself, whoever that is. I am looking forward to finding out. I release you from any obligation toward me. I expect nothing from you, not money, not concern, not regret. I do not want to be your burden or your guilt. I want simply to be gone, and to have that be enough. If you ever think of me, I hope you will think kindly. I hope you will remember that I tried to be what you needed, and I hope you will understand that sometimes trying is not enough. Goodbye, Edward. Clara. Edward read the letter 3 times, then a 4th. He read it until the words began to blur, until his eyes burned, until he could recite entire passages from memory. Then he set it down, very carefully, on the desk where she had written it, and pressed both hands to his face. He did not weep. He had not wept since he was a boy, since his father had told him sternly that dukes did not cry, that emotion was weakness, that control was everything. But something inside him broke anyway, quietly, completely, irreparably. He saw it now, all of it. The years of his parents' marriage, his mother fading slowly into nothing, his father's complete obliviousness, or perhaps his complete indifference. Edward still did not know which was worse, and he saw himself doing exactly the same thing, becoming exactly the man he had sworn never to be. Clara had tried to reach him. She had said so in the letter. She had asked him to walk with her, had tried to share her thoughts, her discoveries, her delight in small things, and he had dismissed it all as pleasant but unimportant, trivial, not worth interrupting his real work for. The fox I saw near the North Woods. He remembered that now, or thought he did. A morning at breakfast, weeks ago. She had been animated, more animated than usual, describing something she had seen on her walk. He had been reading a letter from his steward about crop rotation in the South Fields. He had made some non-committal response without looking up. How pleasant. 2 words. Casual, dismissive. He had not meant to hurt her. He had simply been distracted, busy. There had been actual problems that needed his attention, actual decisions that needed to be made. But to her, those 2 words had meant, you do not matter. Your joy does not matter. You do not matter enough for me to put down this letter and look at you. How many times had he done that? How many small moments had he missed or dismissed or failed to see? 1,000, she had said. 1,000 small things that had accumulated into something unbearable. Edward stood abruptly, the chair scraping back. He crossed to the window and looked out at the gardens. Dawn had fully broken now. The rain had stopped. Everything looked clean and new, washed by the storm. He thought of Clara standing here at this window, looking out at these same gardens. What had she seen? What had she felt? Invisible, she had said. She had felt invisible. He had made her invisible. Not through cruelty, through absence, through the systematic, relentless withholding of attention, of interest, of genuine engagement, through treating her as a pleasant fixture of his life, rather than a person with her own inner world, her own needs, her own capacity for pain. Would you have seen it coming? Would you have noticed the woman beside you slowly disappearing? Or would you have been too busy with important things, too focused on duty and responsibility and maintaining perfect control, to see the most important thing slipping away? Edward turned from the window. The letter lay on the desk, Clara's careful handwriting marching across the page in neat, even lines. He could go after her. He could try to find her. He could... What? Apologize? Promise to change? Beg her to give him another chance? She had asked him not to. She had been clear, please do not come looking for me. And she was right. What could he possibly say that would matter now? How could he promise to be different when he had proven, over and over, across 8 months of marriage, that this was who he was? He had not lied to her. He had been exactly what he promised to be, stable, secure, respectful, kind in his limited way. And it had not been enough. It had been a slow death instead of a quick one. That was all. Edward sank back into the chair and picked up the letter one more time. His eyes fell on a passage near the end. You have lived so long in your carefully constructed world of propriety and emotional distance that you have forgotten, or perhaps never learned, how to reach across that distance toward another person. She was right, he did not know how. His father had never taught him, had never shown him, had modeled only duty and control and the careful suppression of anything resembling vulnerability or need. And Edward had learned that lesson well, too well. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in his breast pocket, over his heart. Then he stood, left Clara's room, and closed the door behind him. Some lessons come too late to use. Some understanding arrives only after the door has already closed. Edward knows this now. Do you? The weeks that followed Clara's departure were strange. Edward moved through them in a fog, performing his duties mechanically, speaking when spoken to, making decisions about tenant disputes and drainage problems and crop rotations with the same methodical efficiency he had always brought to such matters. But he was not present. Not really. Part of him remained in that room upstairs, reading and rereading Clara's letter, trying to understand how he had failed so completely, without ever realizing he was failing at all. He did not search for her. She had asked him not to, and he respected that wish, even as it tore at him. Even as he woke in the night, sometimes with a desperate need to know, was she safe? Was she warm? Was she happy? Had leaving him brought her the freedom she sought, or only a different kind of loneliness? He imagined her in various scenarios, a cottage by the sea, living quietly with her aunt or some sympathetic friend, a small town where no one knew her name or title. Perhaps she had gone abroad, to Italy or France, places she had mentioned once or twice wanting to see. Wherever she was, he hoped she was well. He hoped she was painting or gardening or simply sitting in sunlight without the weight of his indifference pressing down on her shoulders. The gloves remained on his desk. He could not bring himself to move them. They sat there, pale and accusatory, a constant reminder of what he had possessed and failed to cherish. Sometimes late at night, he would pick them up and hold them, running his thumb over the soft leather, the pearl buttons, the careful stitching, trying to understand the woman who had worn them, trying to see her clearly now that it was too late. His mother visited one afternoon, arriving in her carriage unannounced. She had not been to Graymore since the wedding. She preferred the dower house, she said. Smaller, easier to manage, more suited to a widow living alone. But today she came. Peterson showed her into the drawing room where Edward was attempting to read agricultural reports and failing completely, his mind drifting constantly to Clara, to the letter, to all the moments he should have paid attention to and did not. "Edward," his mother said, removing her gloves, black, he noticed, still in mourning for his father even after all these years, or perhaps in mourning for her own lost life, and sitting in the chair opposite his, the chair that had been Clara's. "Mother, I heard Clara has gone. News travels quickly. It always does, particularly when it involves scandal. Edward felt something tighten in his chest. It is not a scandal. She simply left. Without her husband, without explanation, after only 8 months of marriage. Society will call it scandal regardless of what you prefer to call it. I care very little what society calls it. His mother studied him for a long moment. Her face was as composed as always, that same smooth, impenetrable mask she had worn for as long as he could remember. But something in her eyes was different, softer perhaps, or sadder. "Will she return?" she asked. "No." "You are certain?" "Yes." "I see." His mother folded her hands in her lap, the gesture so familiar it made Edward's throat tighten. How many times had he seen her sit exactly like this, a duchess performing her role perfectly, her true feelings, if she had any, hidden beneath layers of propriety. They sat in silence for a moment. Outside, birds were singing. The sun had emerged after days of rain, and the gardens were bright and green. "I am sorry, Edward," his mother said finally, and her voice was gentler than he had heard it in years. "Are you?" He did not mean it cruelly. He genuinely wanted to know. "Yes, I am sorry you are in pain, and I am sorry I did not. I should have warned you, should have taught you differently, but I did not know how." Edward looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time in decades, and he saw not the cold, composed duchess, but a woman who had been slowly erased by the same forces that had nearly erased Clara. A woman who had survived by learning not to want, not to need, not to reach for anything beyond duty and propriety. "Were you happy?" he asked. "With father?" She blinked, surprised by the question. For a moment he thought she would deflect, would give some diplomatic non-answer, but instead she looked away, toward the window, and said softly, "I was content, for a time, in the beginning. Your father was handsome and respectable, and I thought that would be enough. And then I realized contentment was not the same as living, that being comfortable was not the same as being seen, that having all my material needs met did not address the deeper hunger I had not known I possessed until it went unfed for so long I could no longer remember what it felt like to be satisfied." Edward felt his chest tighten further. "Why did you stay?" "Because I did not know I could leave. Because by the time I understood what I had lost, I had forgotten what I once wanted. Because I had 2 children to raise and a position to maintain, and leaving would have meant scandal and poverty and—" She trailed off, then finished quietly, "Because I was afraid." "Of what?" "Of who I might be without the role. The duchess, the wife, the mother, these were the only identities I had. Without them I was nothing, or so I believed." Edward rose and crossed to the window, unable to sit still any longer. "I have become him," he said. "Haven't I? Father, I have become exactly what he was." His mother did not answer immediately. When she did speak, her voice was measured, thoughtful. "Not exactly. You are gentler than he was, more considerate in practical ways. But in the essential thing, yes. You have learned to withhold yourself, to keep a careful distance, to treat intimacy as something dangerous rather than something necessary. I did not mean to hurt her. I know. Your father did not mean to hurt me either. But intention matters far less than action, or in your case, inaction." Edward pressed his forehead against the glass, just as Clara must have done countless times. The garden stretched below, beautiful and empty. "She tried to tell me," he said. "She tried to reach me, and I did not see it." "No, you did not." The simple agreement, lacking any attempt to soften or excuse, was somehow worse than if his mother had tried to comfort him. "What do I do now?" he asked. "You let her go. You respect her wishes. And you learn from this, Edward. You do not become a man who makes the same mistake twice. I will never marry again. Perhaps not, or perhaps you will, and you will be different, wiser, more present, more capable of seeing the person in front of you rather than merely the role they occupy." She paused, then added gently, "Do not make my mistake. Do not spend the next 30 years existing rather than living." She rose, collecting her gloves. "I should go." "Mother." "Yes? Are you, I should have asked before. Are you happy now?" She smiled then, a real smile, small but genuine. I'm learning to be. It is a long process, learning to be a person rather than a position. But yes, I am better now than I was. After she left, Edward returned to his study. He took Clara's letter from his breast pocket and read it again, this time forcing himself to truly hear every word, every observation, every quiet accusation. She was right about all of it. He had lived in his carefully constructed world of duty and control and emotional distance because it was safe, because it was what he knew, because his father had taught him that this was how a man, particularly a duke, was supposed to be. But his father had been wrong, and Edward, in following that example, had become wrong too. He thought of the fox Clara had seen, the joy in her voice when she had tried to tell him about it, the way he had dismissed that joy with 2 words, how pleasant. He had not meant to diminish her. He had simply been focused on something else, something that had seemed more important at the time. But what was more important than the happiness of the woman sitting across from him? What matter of crop rotation or property drainage or tenant dispute was more urgent than seeing his wife's delight and sharing it with her? Nothing. The answer was nothing. But he had not known that then. He had thought managing the estate was caring for her, providing for her, protecting her. He had thought duty was love. He had been wrong. Edward began, slowly and hesitantly, to change small things in his life. He walked the gardens, not to inspect them or evaluate them, but simply to be in them, to see what Clara had seen. He began to notice things he had never paid attention to before, the way light fell through leaves, the particular shade of pink in the late-blooming roses, the sound of wind moving through the hedge maze. He read the book Clara had given him, the Wordsworth volume he had placed on the shelf unread. He read it slowly, 1 poem at a time, trying to understand what she had loved in it, what she had wanted him to see. One evening he found another passage marked lightly in pencil, "What though the radiance which was once so bright be now forever taken from my sight, though nothing can bring back the hour of splendor in the grass, of glory in the flower. We will grieve not, rather find strength in what remains behind." He sat with that for a long time. Another day, he found a small notebook beneath the bench where Clara used to sit in the south garden. It was wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from rain. Inside were sketches, dozens of them rendered in careful pencil. Flowers, trees, the fountain, the maze, and interspersed with the drawings, fragments of writing. April 27th. The cherry blossoms are extraordinary this year. I wish someone were here to see them with me. May 15th. Edward walked past me today in the hall. I said good morning. He nodded but did not stop. I wonder if he saw me at all, or only the space I occupied. June 3rd. I tried to ask him about his day at dinner. He gave me a summary of tenant meetings and drainage reports. I wanted to know how he felt, what he thought, whether anything had surprised or pleased or frustrated him, but I did not know how to ask for that. And I do not think he would have understood the question anyway. July 22nd. I am lonely. How absurd to be lonely in a house full of people, to be married and still alone. August 9th. I have been thinking about my mother lately. She told me once that marriage was about finding someone who saw you, really saw you past the surface, into the core of who you were. I do not think Edward sees me. I think he sees the Duchess, the wife, the woman who is supposed to be content with comfort and security. But I am not content, and I am afraid to tell him because I think he would not understand, or worse, he would think me ungrateful. September 11th. I am disappearing. I can feel it happening. Each day I become a little less, a little quieter, a little more like a ghost. Soon I will be nothing at all. Just a shape that moves through rooms performing duties, saying polite things, existing without living, like his mother. God help me, I am becoming his mother. Edward closed the notebook and pressed it against his chest, as though trying to absorb through proximity what he had failed to absorb when Clara was present. She had left this behind deliberately, he realized. Hidden, but not destroyed. A record of her inner life. The thoughts and feelings she had not been able to share with him directly. A gift, perhaps, or an indictment, or both. He carried the notebook back to his study and placed it on his desk beside the gloves. Evidence of a life he had shared space with, but never truly entered. He understood now. But understanding had come too late. This is how people disappear. Not all at once, but slowly. One unheard word at a time. One dismissed joy at a time. One moment of not being seen at a time. Until there is nothing left to see. Clara understood this. Now Edward does too. 6 months passed. Autumn turned to winter, and winter to early spring. The world continued its rotations, indifferent to Edward's grief. The estate required management. The tenants needed their duke. Life, despite everything, persisted. Edward did not remarry. He did not even entertain the thought. His mother suggested once that he might eventually consider it, for the sake of an heir, if nothing else. But he had looked at her with such hollow devastation that she never mentioned it again. He lived quietly at Greymore. He managed his estates with the same efficiency as always, but now he also did something he had never done before. He listened. When his tenants came to him with problems, he asked questions. He learned their names, their children's names, their concerns beyond rent and yields. He walked his lands not to inspect them, but to know them. He was trying, in his clumsy way, to learn to see. He kept the gloves. They sat. On his desk, always visible, never moved. A reminder of what he had failed to value when it was present. Some nights, he would sit alone in his study and hold them, running his fingers over the soft leather, and try to remember every conversation he had ever had with Clara, every moment they had shared, trying to see them differently now, with new eyes, with understanding that had come too late to matter. He realized, slowly and painfully, that he had loved her. He had not understood it at the time, had not recognized the feeling for what it was because it had not matched the passionate, consuming love described in poetry and novels. His love had been quiet, comfortable, easy, too easy. He had loved her the way one might love a pleasant view from a window, beautiful, appreciated in an abstract way but not engaged with, not really seen, taken for granted, because it was always there and always would be, until it wasn't. He thought of her constantly, wondered where she was, how she was, living, whether she had found what she was looking for. He hoped she was painting again. She had mentioned once, early in their marriage, that she used to paint watercolors, but had given it up for lack of time and space. He hoped she had both now. He hoped she was surrounded by people who saw her, who listened when she spoke, who noticed when she was delighted by something small and beautiful, and who delighted with her rather than dismissing it as trivial. He hoped most of all that she was happy, and he hoped she never thought of him, because thinking of him could only bring pain, and she had suffered enough of that already. He received no communication from her, no letters, no messages through intermediaries. She had severed the connection completely and cleanly, like a surgeon removing something diseased. He did not blame her. One afternoon in March, nearly 7 months after Clara had left, a letter arrived. Edward was in his study when Peterson brought it in on a silver tray, his expression carefully neutral in the way that suggested the butler knew this letter was significant. The envelope was cream-colored, thick paper, expensive, but not ostentatious. There was no return address. The handwriting was unfamiliar. Not Clara's careful script, but someone else's, looser and more decorative. Edward's hands shook slightly as he opened it. Inside was a brief note, written by someone who signed herself only as a friend. The message was simple. Your Grace, I write at the request of someone who wishes you to know she is well and safe. She has found a small community of people who welcome her, and she is beginning to remember what it feels like to exist fully rather than partially. She is painting again. She has established a small garden. She is, I think, discovering who she is when she is not performing a role. She asked me to thank you for letting her go. She says it was the kindest thing you could have done, the only thing that could have been done, and she bears you no ill will. She wanted you to know this so you would not carry unnecessary guilt. She understands that you did not mean to hurt her, and she hopes you will learn from what happened rather than being destroyed by it. That is all she wished me to convey. She asks that you do not attempt to respond to this letter or to discover her location. She needs distance to continue healing, and she trusts you will respect that need as you have respected her wish not to be pursued. I wish you well. Your Grace. A friend tucked inside the letter was something else. A single pressed flower. A wild rose, pale pink, carefully preserved between two pieces of tissue paper. Edward held it with trembling fingers. The same flower Clara had placed in his Wordsworth book months ago. Or perhaps a sister to that flower picked from the same hedgerow. A message. I remember, and I am grateful you let me go. He sat for a long time, holding the flower, reading and rereading the brief note. She was well. She was safe. She was discovering herself. The relief was overwhelming, but beneath it was a grief so profound it took his breath away. She was happy, finally, genuinely happy, and it had nothing to do with him, everything to do with his absence. He placed the flower carefully in the Wordsworth book, next to the one Clara had left before. 2 roses, a beginning and an ending. Then he sat down and wrote a response, knowing it would never be sent, knowing no one would ever read it, but needing to. Write it anyway. Clara, I understand now. Too late, but I understand. You were right about everything. I did not see you. I saw the role you occupied, the function you performed, the convenient, undemanding presence you represented. I took your silence for contentment and your compliance for happiness. I mistook your gradual disappearance for tranquility. I have read your letter 100 times. I have read your notebook. I have walked the gardens you loved and tried to see them as you did. I have finally understood what you were asking for, what you needed, what I failed to give. You wanted to be known, to be seen as yourself, not as a duchess or wife, but as Clara, a person with thoughts and feelings and delights and sorrows that mattered, that deserved attention, that were worth interrupting crop reports and tenant meetings for. You were right that I did not know how to give that. My father never taught me. He modeled only distance and control, and I, fool that I am, thought that was strength. Thought that was how a man, particularly a duke, was supposed to be. I was wrong. I have learned this too late to offer it to you, but perhaps not too late to become different for myself, to learn to see the world and the people in it as more than roles and functions, to pay attention, to care not just about outcomes but about the human beings affected by those outcomes. You have given me an unexpected gift in leaving. You have shown me what I was becoming. You have saved me from spending the next 40 years the way my father did, a ghost haunting his own life, managing everything and experiencing nothing. I'm grateful. I am sorry. I hope you are painting beautiful things. I hope your garden flourishes. I hope you are surrounded by people who delight in you, who notice when you are happy and care enough to ask when you are not. I hope you never think of me except perhaps occasionally, with the mild sadness one feels for someone who had potential but wasted it. I will not try to find you. I respect your need for distance, but please know that I will keep your gloves on my desk for the rest of my life, and every time I see them, I will remember what I failed to cherish, and I will try to be better. Not for you. It is too late for that, but for myself, and for anyone else who might in the future trust me enough to try to be seen by me. Thank you for trying. Thank you for reaching for me even when I did not reach back. Thank you for leaving when staying would have destroyed you. I hope you find everything you are looking for. He folded the letter and placed it in a drawer with Clara's letter and the notebook. Private documents, a record of failure and understanding. Then he stood and walked to the window. Spring was beginning. The gardens were coming alive again, crocuses pushing through the soil, buds forming on the rose bushes, birds returning from wherever they had spent the winter. Everything renewing itself. Everything except what he had lost. The drawing room remained largely as it had been. Clara's chair sat by the window, empty. Edward never sat in it. Sometimes he would stand in the doorway and look at it, remembering her sitting there in the afternoon light, her face turned toward the gardens, waiting for something he had never given. He left the chair empty. Some absences, he had learned, should not be filled. They were memorials, reminders, lessons made visible. One evening, nearly a year after Clara had left, Edward's mother visited again. They sat together in the drawing room, she in her usual chair, he in his, Clara's between them like a ghost. "You are different," his mother observed. "Am I?" "Yes, softer somehow, more present, more alive." Edward smiled faintly. "Ironic, isn't it, that I had to lose her to learn to be present?" "Not ironic, tragic. but perhaps also necessary. Some lessons cannot be taught, only learned through consequence. They sat in silence for a while, watching the fire. "Do you think she will ever come back?" his mother asked. "No." "Are you hoping she will?" Edward considered this. "No," he said finally. "I hope she stays away. I hope she has found the life she needs, the life I could not give her. Coming back would only trap her again. That is generous of you." "It is not generosity. It is the minimum I owe her." His mother nodded. "You have learned something then?" "Yes, but the price was too high. All worthwhile lessons cost more than we wished to pay." They sat together until the fire burned low, two people who had learned the same lesson from different angles, in different times, but with the same essential understanding. That absence can be a form of violence. That silence can suffocate. That love to be real must be active, visible, given freely and specifically to the particular person in front of you, not to the role they occupy or the function they perform. That seeing someone, really seeing them, is not optional. It is everything. The gloves remained on Edward's desk. He kept them there for the rest of his life, not as a trophy or a possession, but as a reminder of the woman he had failed to see. Every morning when he sat down to work, he saw them, and he remembered, not with sentimentality or self-pity, but with clear-eyed understanding. He had been given something precious, and he had not known its value until he had already lost it. This is how we learn sometimes, through loss, through absence, through the terrible clarity that comes when it is too late to use it. Edward learned. The lesson was brutal, permanent, and true, but Clara was free. And in the end, perhaps that was the only thing that mattered. What will you notice today that you have been failing to see? What quiet voice have you been dismissing as unimportant? What person beside you has been disappearing while you looked elsewhere? The gloves are still there. The question is, will you see them before it is too late?